Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's start chapter 3 of the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. This one continuing the theme associated with Close Encounters of So-and-so Kind. I previously covered Close Encounters of the First and the Second Kind. Chapter 3 though will actually cover Close Encounters of the Third kind. These are the kind that are reported to be with animated entities, often called humanoids, occupants, or sometimes UFOnauts, which have been reported as this type of encounter. So in other words, they basically came across an actual alien, an actual extraterrestrial. So as always, this book and this chapter will highlight multiple examples associated with it. Reading some of the chapter already, I can see I've talked about some of those instances here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll do part 1 here, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. Love to hear what your thoughts are with regards to this new Close Encounter. So let's go ahead and let's do part 1 of chapter 3, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. First segment is called The Problem of Evidence. UFO sightings are, of course, open to a number of different interpretations. Even a genuine unknown is not necessarily an alien spacecraft. As discussed in the introduction, highly unusual aerial objects might be explainable in terms of very advanced, but nevertheless human technology, such as stealth or remotely piloted vehicles. They might also represent atmospheric phenomena that are ill understood, such as ball lightning. Likewise, physical traces left by UFOs present their own problems for ufologists attempting to secure absolute proof of an extraterrestrial origin. The central problem lies in the fact that the universe is made of essentially the same stuff that is found on Earth, with the results that many fragments purporting to come from an alien spacecraft will more than likely be constructed from elements that are found on our own planet, perhaps in abundance. If those elements are shown to be combined in unusual ways, then things get a little more interesting, and yet even this might not constitute proof of an alien origin. For example, in the unlikely event that a piece of a stealth bomber fell off during a flight and landed on a ranch in New Mexico, prompting the bemused owner to hand it over to the local UFO group for analysis, the news would doubtlessly hurtle around the world and cause a media frenzy. While many people would point to this strange fragment with its unknown metallurgical and chemical composition as the long-awaited final proof of an ET presence, the truth would of course be quite different. The stealth coating on the skin of a B-2 and an F-117A aircraft that enables them to slip through the sky as virtually unnoticed by radar is very highly classified. Were a civilian laboratory to attempt to analyze the substance, they would doubtless be extremely perplexed, perhaps even astounded. It will contain elements that are commonly found on Earth, but put together in a totally novel way, and thus would constitute proof, at least to the more enthusiastic extraterrestrialists, that we are indeed not alone. With a phenomenon as elusive and perplexing as UFOs, this problem looks set to be with us for some time to come, and increases dramatically when we begin to consider its most bizarre aspects, namely the alleged sighting and interaction with the occupants of UFOs. Of course, one would assume that interaction with a vastly superior alien culture would be bizarre in the extreme, something which perhaps should be considered a criterion for authenticity. However, we must bear in mind that with so-called high strangeness comes a blurring of the distinction between what happens outside the mind and what happens within. Far from being a glibly skeptical dismissal of alien encounter reports, this notion actually has the potential to open up a rich vein of surprising and perhaps shocking speculation on their ultimate nature. Next segment is called Joe Simonton's Pancakes. Joe Simonton was a 60-year-old chicken farmer who lived alone near Eagle River, Wisconsin. At about 11 a.m. on April 18, 1961, Simonton heard a strange noise coming from outside his small house. He described the sound as similar to knobby tires on a wet pavement. He went outside to investigate and was confronted with an astonishing sight. Hovering a few feet above the ground was a saucer-shaped object of a bright silvery color, 30 feet in diameter and about 12 feet high. Suddenly, a hatch opened up on the side of the object, revealing 3 men inside, whom Simonton described as looking a little like Italians, with dark hair and olive complexions. They wore black two-piece outfits with turtlenecks and balaclava-type helmets. One of the men produced a metal jug and motioned to Simonton, who assumed they needed water. This seems to echo the behavior of the great airship pilots of the late 1890s, some of whom occasionally requested water and other consumables from witnesses. Simonton happily obliged, filling the jug with water from his house and handing it over. When he did so, he noticed that one of the UFO occupants was cooking something on a flameless grill inside the craft. One of the men noticed Simonton's interest and handed him 3 pancakes. Another crewman then closed the hatch, and the object rose about 20 feet before heading off to the south. Simonton then called Sheriff Schroeder, whom he had known for 14 years. The sheriff sent 2 deputies to Simonton's house. Although they could find no evidence to support the veracity of his claims, it was generally accepted that the old farmer had not concocted the story and that he truly believed what he had reported. The case was investigated by Dr. J. Allen Hynek on behalf of the U.S. Air Force, who concluded that Joe Simonton was trustworthy and that Mr. Simonton felt that his contact had been a real experience. The pancakes were analyzed by the Air Force. Simonton had eaten one of them and found it rather unappetizing, tasting like cardboard. The analysis yielded results that were perhaps unsurprising. The cake was composed of hydrogenated fat, starch, buckwheat hulls, soybean hulls, and wheat bran. Bacteria and radiation readings were normal for this material. Chemical, infrared, and other destructive type tests were run on this material. The Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare concluded that the material was an ordinary pancake of terrestrial origin. This UFO sounds rather like some cosmic version of Aeroflot, whose cabin crews routinely cook in-flight meals on gas stove in the aisles. This hardly bodes well for a little interpretation of the encounter. Genuine extraterrestrials may well be expected to behave in very unusual ways, but surely we must draw the line at frying buckwheat pancakes in their spaceships. And yet, if we accept that Joe Simonton generally believed what he reported, where does this take us? Jacques Vallée, perhaps the most original mind in ufology, is most reluctant to regard the Eagle River case as solved, in spite of the U.S. Air Force conclusion that Simonton had a waking dream, which his mind inserted into the continuum of events around him of which he was conscious. Vallée believes that Simonton's encounter may indicate the activities of a non-human intelligence that has perhaps always existed alongside us here on Earth, and whose presence has through the ages been represented by us in a variety of different ways, each of which conforms to the world prevalent at the time. According to Vallée, the most striking parallel with modern alien encounters exists in the folktales and legends associated with a race of beings known as the Gentry in Ireland or the Good People in Scotland. In the Celtic traditions of Western and Central Europe, these supernatural beings had many contacts with humans, most commonly in remote places, frequently playing tricks on them, but also helping them in times of hardship. It was not unusual for a member of this fairy race to ask something of a human, perhaps as a test of goodwill. The UFOnauts asked Simonton for some water. If the human gave what was asked, the gift was made, sometimes in the form of food. Simonton received some pancakes for his trouble. Although this idea may sound completely outlandish to those encountering it for the first time, perhaps even more so than the idea that aliens could fry their dinners in an aircraft, it actually offers one of the most intriguing and potentially useful ways of approaching the whole problem of encounters with non-humans. As such, it demands a section to itself and will be dealt with in greater detail later on in this book. However, as far as Joe Simonton and his pancakes are concerned, it does seem more feasible, to this writer at least, that he suffered a temporary, although ultimately harmless, aberration in which he hallucinated his encounter. Perhaps he had just made himself some pancakes when the hallucination took hold. They were ordinary pancakes of terrestrial origin. Perhaps when we returned to normal consciousness, he looked down and saw the evidence in his own hands. Next one is called the Socorro Landing. One of the most famous and impressive close encounters of the third kind occurred on April 24th, 1964, south of the town of Socorro, New Mexico. Yet even this case contains certain elements that imply that the encounter was not quite what it seemed. At about 5:45 p.m., patrolman Lonnie Zamora was in pursuit of a speeding motorist when his attention was seized by the roar of an object ascending in the distance. The object, which he described as resembling an upended automobile, was emitting a bright flame from its underside. As the object landed, Zamora, fearing the flame might ignite a nearby dynamite shack, abandoned his chase and drove his patrol car up and over a ridge in search of a better vantage point. About 150 yards away, he saw not only the craft at rest, but also two small figures dressed in what looked like white coveralls. The figures, which he estimated to be about 4 feet tall, were moving around the object, which appeared to be made of an aluminum-like metal and rested on 4 diagonal landing struts. On the side of the object was an unusual red insignia, which consisted of an upward pointing arrow bounded by a semicircle above and a horizontal line below. At that point, one of the figures noticed his presence and appeared to jump as if startled. Thinking that they might be in need of help, Zamora drove on a little way and radioed his headquarters, informing them that he was at the scene of a possible accident. As he climbed from his car, he heard several loud bumps as if someone was shutting a door. Zamora proceeded on foot and got to within about 50 paces of the object when it produced a loud roar and then lifted off. The roar was so intense that the patrolman suddenly feared for his safety and ran to take cover while the object rose to a height of about 15 feet and then accelerated away over an adjacent mountain range. A few moments later, Sergeant Sam Chavez arrived and was struck by his colleague's agitated state. Together, they inspected the landing site and discovered 4 depressions about 2 inches deep and 4 burn marks in the brush, together with some shallower prints that Zamora assumed had been made by the occupants. Both Chavez and Zamora were interviewed by representatives of Project Blue Book, including Dr. Hynek, who concluded that Zamora, although not overtly bright or articulate, is basically sincere, honest, and reliable. He would not be capable of contriving a complex hoax, nor would his temperament indicate that he would have the slightest interest in such. Zamora also exhibited a trait that Hynek had noticed in other UFO witnesses, the desire to have the sighting explained in conventional terms, in contrast to the common misconception that witnesses see what they wish to see, so that they may be relieved of the burden of having encountered something beyond their ability to comprehend. According to Hynek, both Zamora and Chavez appeared to be hoping that I could tell them that this had been a secret Air Force device, so that they could dismiss the whole thing from their minds. In fact, this case was a turning point for Dr. Hynek, who had hitherto maintained a highly skeptical attitude to UFOs and had aided the Air Force in explaining many previous sightings. In August 1964 and March 1965, he made 2 more trips to Socorro, satisfying himself completely that Zamora had not perpetrated a hoax. He had also been unable to uncover any Air Force projects that might account for what Zamora had seen. Thus, Hynek began tentatively to entertain the notion that some UFOs might indeed be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Since Project Blue Book could find no conventional explanation, the case was listed as unidentified, the only landing occupant case so designated in their files. However, there remain several inconsistencies in the Socorro case. For instance, a man named Felix Phillips and his wife lived approximately 1,000 feet away from the UFO landing site. They were both home at the time of the encounter, and yet neither heard the loud roar of the craft as it arrived and departed. Hynek explained this by pointing out that their house was downwind of the site and a strong southwesterly wind was blowing at the time, although this could not be confirmed since Socorro did not have a weather station. UFO skeptic Philip J. Klass investigated the Socorro case and interviewed Felix Phillips. Phillips told him that several windows had been opened, but nothing had been heard from 1,000 feet away. Zamora, on the other hand, had been in a speeding car 4,000 feet away and yet had heard the roar of the object's arrival. Other inconsistencies came from Zamora himself, who changed his story in the years after the encounter, later saying that he had heard a roar roar but no flame as the object ascended. He also claimed he had seen a rock that had been melted by the intense heat of the engine exhaust. However, the Air Force site investigation revealed no such thing and also concluded that the sporadic burning of the brush was inconsistent with the powerful rocket-like blast Zamora reported. The landing prints left behind by the object also presented a problem, since their kite-like pattern meant that the struts would have been non-symmetrical, of unequal lengths and angles. Any object that attempted to land on them would have promptly fallen over. There was also the question of the location of the landing site on land owned by the mayor of Socorro named Holm Bursum. Plans were soon being made to turn the site into a tourist attraction. Socorro was not a particularly wealthy town and would have benefited greatly from the interest generated by Zamora's sighting. This led skeptics such as Philip Klaus to conclude that the encounter had been a hoax, designed to put Socorro on the tourist map. So what happened at Socorro? Did Lonnie Zamora encounter beings from another world, or was it all a cynical ploy to bring in tourist dollars? As the cliche goes, we may never know. Before we move on, however, it must be mentioned that Ray Stanford, an investigator with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, was at the landing site with Dr. Hynek and discovered some tiny fragments of metal on a rock. Together with some other NICAP members, Stanford took the samples to NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center at Greenbelt, Maryland, in order to have it analyzed by qualified space scientists. According to Stanford, when the rock was returned to NICAP after analysis, every trace of the metal had been removed. The whole thing had been scraped clean. Dr. Henry Frankel, head of the Spacecraft Systems Branch and director of the analysis, explained that they had to get enough of the material to make an accurate analysis. Frankel assured Stanford that the results of the analysis would be available in a few days. In the meantime, Stanford spoke to a U.S. Navy captain in Washington who told him that if something anomalous was discovered in the samples, NICAP would never get them back from NASA. National security considerations would see to that. It is unclear whether the samples were ever returned. On August 5, 1964, Stanford phoned Dr. Frankel at the Goddard Space Flight Center. Frankel had interesting news. The samples contained a material that could not occur naturally, a zinc-iron alloy of a particular ratio that was not present on any charts of alloys known to be manufactured on Earth, the USSR included. This finding definitely strengthens the case that might be made for an extraterrestrial origin of the Socorro object. According to Frankel, the material would make an excellent, highly malleable, and corrosive-resistant coating for a spacecraft landing gear. Stanford made many attempts throughout the rest of August to get in touch with Frankel again, but was rebuffed on every occasion. Frankel, it seemed, was either unavailable or in a top-level security conference or unprepared at this time to discuss the information that Stanford was calling about. Eventually, Stanford was contacted by Thomas P. Sciacca Jr. of NASA's Spacecraft System Branch, who notified him of the official conclusion of the analysis. According to Sciacca, everything Stanford had been told by Frankel was a mistake. Frankel was no longer involved with the matter. The sample was determined to be silica. And then that ends that segment. Next one is called The Watcher in the Field. Photographs of UFOs are controversial enough, constituting additional extraordinary claims rather than extraordinary evidence. In the 5 decades of modern ufology, they have provided food for intense discussion, given the relative ease with which they can be and indeed have been faked. When a photograph is allegedly taken of an alien, however, the controversy increases dramatically. While some research point to such photographs as unequivocal proof that we are not alone, more cautious ufologists, not to mention the skeptics, point out that photographs of aliens are just as easy to fake, as if not easier than photographs of the UFOs they are alleged to pilot. However, once in a blue moon, a photograph comes along that sends a shiver of terror and exhilaration down the spine. One such picture was taken by a fireman named Jim Templeton during a family outing with his wife and 2 daughters in Cumbria, England. The weather on May 24th, 1964 was warm and sunny, and Templeton was taking pictures of his family in a quiet area of marshland. Everything seemed normal. The family saw nothing unusual whatsoever during their day out. When the family returned home and Templeton had the pictures developed, however, he saw something most unusual on one of the prints. A figure was clearly visible, standing behind one of Templeton's daughter, a figure that had not been visible when the photograph was taken. As if this was not bizarre enough, the figure appeared to be wearing a white spacesuit with a dark, featureless visor. Based on the apparent position of the man in the photograph, he is either floating a good several inches above the ground or is very tall. Looking for an explanation, the Templeton sent the photograph to Kodak, which had developed it. The initial cause, which Kodak put forward, that the image was caused by an accidental double exposure, was abandoned because the girl's head completely obscures the lower part of the man, which would not happen in a double exposure. According to Jenny Randles, who spent more time investigating the case than any other ufologist, Kodak offered free film for life to anyone who could come up with an answer to the puzzle. That prize is still unclaimed. 26 years later, in 1990, the picture was blown up to life size as part of an advertising campaign for a local photocopying firm, revealing additional structures in the image. The visor was not entirely featureless after all. It was semi-transparent and revealed apparent ears within the helmet and breathing tubes. Skeptics have claimed that this image is nothing more than a flaw in the photographic emulsion, an assertion that is somewhat unlikely in view of the fact that the image is clearly and unequivocally that of a white-suited figure in a helmet and visor. As Jenny Randall states, an emulsion flaw producing such an image would constitute a coincidence as amazing as the proverbial monkey typing out the works of Shakespeare by chance. In a curious postscript to a curious tale, Randall reports a conversation she had with Jim Templeton in 1990, in which he said that after the pictures had been developed, he was visited by two mysterious men claiming to be government investigators who arrived in a dark Jaguar car. They took him out to the marsh where the man had been photographed and asked him questions about the behavior of the animals on the marsh at the time. When Templeton dismissed their suggestion that the strange figure was just an ordinary man, they became annoyed and promptly drove off, leaving him there 5 miles from his home. Randall points to the similarity between this puzzling encounter and the activities of the so-called men in black who have often been reported to harass witnesses to UFO-related events and who will be discussed later. It seems clear enough, though, that this is one of the most intriguing cases that are amenable to one of only two conclusions. Either the Templetons were lying and the entire episode was a hoax, or they were telling the truth, in which case they shared their day out with a person who was not only wearing a spacesuit, but who was visible or was invisible as well. Where that person came from, what he was doing there, and where he went are questions that will surely haunt anyone who sees the Templeton photograph. And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's end part 1 of chapter 3. This one again titled Close Encounters of the Third Kind from the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. So as you can see, some good examples already associated with encounters with these so-called aliens, humanoids, extraterrestrials, and so on. Let's talk about that briefly. So yes, Joe Simonton's pancakes, I have talked about that before. I did that in a video, got a good number of views as well. Fascinating case, right? The idea that you have something there, UFO landing, and then you have these extraterrestrials saying almost hello, needing some kind of water, and then as a reward, basically giving him pancakes. I don't recall, though, going through that notion that it was mainly a hallucination. I don't remember that in my video, but that's another angle, at least, that's being presented here. Interesting stuff, though, because, again, there was that proof associated with the pancakes, but did he truly make it? Or was it something where it really was an extraterrestrial sighting that he had and they just happened to be cooking pancakes in their UFO? That's the core landing segment too. I just talked about that. That was pretty interesting. When I was reading in the chapter how a strange coincidence. I just talked about that only a few weeks ago. Here we have that situation where, again, you have that policeman, that patrolman who encounters this UFO, and then along the way almost kind of chases it but doesn't, but at least sees it ascend up into the air, and then sees what he describes as those little figures, almost like they're startled and so on. And then they had that look associated with them, those white coveralls, like the Michelin Man, as I was mentioning. So pretty fascinating that this was being highlighted here. Also pretty interesting. I don't recall mentioning that in the video about the town, the Socorro town, turning into a tourist attraction, and maybe this would have been their angle if indeed they were truly faking everything associated with the encounter. Kind of a little far-fetched on my end, but who knows? Money is always a big motivator on things. But again, something interesting that I didn't know, that I didn't talk about within my video. And the last one, the Watcher in the Field, that one I did talk about a little while back, a couple of years back. One of my good videos there too. I love talking about it. Got some good views as well. It's about that mysterious astronaut that was floating in the background behind the young girl that wasn't there, obviously, when they were taking the picture, but appeared afterward. So pretty fascinating stuff too. I didn't know about Kodak basically doing a reward, free film for the life of anyone if they could find proof about it being a hoax, but looks like it's still out there. And then also the angle involving the Men in Black, pretty fascinating stuff too. So as you can see, several encounters, all of them basically having the person, the main user, seeing these creatures, whatever they were, and then each of them having these bizarre encounters. So very, very interesting stuff. I'd love to see what the rest of the chapter entails. But let me know what your comments are. Post them below with regards to at least these separate instances. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.